Hi, my name's Andrew Dudley, and this is Earth Live, a webcast featuring interviews with people working on the front lines of conservation. Today, we're joined with Richard Donovan from Vermont. How you doing, Richard?
Just great.
So you've been working on a consultation called the Global Standard for Forest Ecosystem Restoration, and you've just put that out for public consultation.
That's right.
Can we ask you what the motivation was behind this?
So there has been a lot of attention focused on restoration starting in about 2014. You had things like the Bond Challenge, the New York Declaration on Forests, where companies and governments were all making commitments to restore a big area, literally millions and millions of hectares or acres. And when I was initially invited to be an expert advisor to a group of people that were financing some of this restoration, I asked them in essence, well, what are your tools, your ways of measuring progress? How are you making sure that when you invest, you get a return on that investment? And honestly, and I asked that also of the organizations that were implementing it as well. And the answers that came back weren't very convincing. There were some kind of efforts to basically say, well, the people implementing will do their own reporting and they'll tell you what they've done. And I said, well, is that going to be based on pictures? Is that going to be based on metrics using, satellite imagery or things like that? It wasn't very clear. I talked to one company, which was a retail brand that had invested in restoration, and they had been supporting restoration in southern Brazil for years. And I asked them, well, how do you know what's been successful? What's happened? And they said, honestly, we don't know today how successful that restoration was. And it just took me way back to when I helped create the Forest Stewardship Council back in 1990. And in those days, it was the same problem with forest management in general. There were no systems for accountability. So I started working on my own. And then I reached out to a couple different organizations, and a group called Nature, Economy, and People, Nepcon, came to me, and they said, Richard, we'd like to support and work with you on this to create greater accountability. We want to see restoration be successful. That's the idea. Because if that happens, the climate will be better, people's livelihoods will be better, etc. And so that's kind of the roots of the whole restoration verification protocol.
So, Richard, you mentioned Nepcon. What do they do?
Nepcon's an international nonprofit organization focused on nature, economy, and people. It is headquartered in Estonia and Denmark and been around for about 25 years. I was involved years and years ago when they were getting established, and they've kept evolving over the years. And now they have offices in, I think, 13, 14 different countries around the world. And they're doing basically auditing of sustainability that's one of their primary focal points in their work. They are training people in all the countries they work. So the idea is to kind of create a core of people that are in those countries, from those countries, that can do that work rather than having to get me, on a plane from Vermont going to Indonesia. The idea is to have Indonesians do it. So they've really tried to focus on building local capacity for doing, in essence, sustainability auditing, among other things.
Now, as you've been developing the standard, what's been the reception so far from the rest of the industry?
It's kind of interesting because you have some people that are really excited about it, interested in it. We went out, we did some confidential reviews with about 50 different scientists and practitioners. The vast majority of them were like, yeah, this is needed. This is what we need to see happen. We need to see better accountability, and we need a practical tool for doing that. There were some people who said, well, actually, we can do our own job. We know how to report back, and we can do it on our own credibly. But when you then talk to the financiers and the others, they were kind of like, well, I don't know. We would prefer that there be a consistent framework for evaluating success in restoration. And we'd actually like to get into working with independent auditors or specialists to check progress. Because, this is logical. This is why you have auditors in a whole bunch of different businesses. It's good that a company audits itself. that's a good practice. But then when you put independence in it, it just adds an extra level of rigor and credibility. And it's been kind of ironic to me that we've actually had some NGOs and we've had some of the restoration practitioners who've resisted it, saying, well, that's going to be too complicated for us. I think over time, they will get over that. I think over time, it will make restoration better. It'll improve the models and make them more responsive to what's going on in the field.
Thank you. And so you stress the importance of considering non-biological social issues such as FPIC and including cultural resources, watersheds, cemeteries, religious trees. Why is this important?
Historically, what we've found in forestry, and this goes back 30 to 40 years, is that for a long time, how people did things was imposed by either government or companies. And local people were told, here's how you need to do it. This is what you have to do. What we learned over the years was that was not so effective. We learned that when local people were engaged and local people valued what was being done, that they placed more importance on it. And they actually, something as simple as tree planting, if they themselves, at one point there was a movement where people were just being given the seedlings, they wouldn't pay anything for them, everything was free. What was found from that experience was they didn't value what they were planting. Mm-hmm. And so what would happen is the trees would die. You'd get 10, 20, 30% survival rates. So if all of that labor, all that work that was going into planting the trees, it was lost. And so what we found over time is that you have to engage with the local people, and that brings success. But when you do that, you also have to respect their values. And that may mean with an indigenous group, they may have sacred trees. They may have sacred cemetery areas. They may have spiritual areas. And if you can't plant trees in those are areas that are sacred to them, and you have to respect that. If you do that, they come on board. They get involved. Watersheds are a great example because for many communities, their water comes from watersheds. And if you help support and restore those watersheds, they see that value and they appreciate it, and they'll work with you and they'll be committed to it, and they will keep those plants living for a long time. And ultimately the goal here is to restore forest, and you just increase your chances of success if you do that.
That makes sense. Are there any particular stakeholders that you're seeking support from?
We would like to get the support of a pretty broad range of stakeholders. This means organizations that are the investors, that are the people actually financing the restoration. We would like to get NGOs, particularly environmental and social NGOs, supporting it. We would also like to get the practitioners themselves that are doing it. It is really important in some countries that government get behind it. Sometimes government is not the complete answer. There are many people who've historically said, well, as long as government says they have to do it, they'll do it. Well, not really. It doesn't really work that way. You may think you can just tell communities what to do, and government sometimes feels like it can do that. But in our experience, that's not necessarily true. So the more we can engage government in doing this kind of approach to accountability, we think the more the better it will be for the success of the efforts.
You've spoken previously about ecologists and foresters not talking together. Why is that a challenge?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I sent you an article that was written by those professors from Bangor University in Wales. And they did research, and what they found was that there was a gap between the two professions. The foresters looked at, hey, as long as it's trees, any kind of trees, that we can then subsequently harvest and process in many cases, it's okay. And the ecologists on the other side are saying, well, as long as it's ecological restoration, we don't have to think so much about the people. We just try to make sure it's ecologically sound. And the two weren't talking. They were like ships in the night. And so you've got this kind of artificial debate where they're kind of arguing over stuff that honestly all it does is hold back restoration. And so what we're trying to do, and we're explicit in this restoration verification protocol, we're explicit in saying these different communities of people need to talk and they need to interchange ideas. and they need to value the position of the others. If you're a purist on either end, chances are restoration is not going to be successful, and we need to engage people of all kinds in it. So I'm hopeful that we can bridge that gap between the ecologists and the foresters. I think that the world is very different than it was 30 years ago. You have a lot of ecologically minded foresters today, and you have more and more ecologists that appreciate that there has to be socioeconomic value behind when you're doing restoration. And you can't just get away with just purist approaches to things. That said, you've still got dogma, and we got to fight that a little bit and see, and maybe see if we can change people's perspectives on some things. And the best way of doing that, honestly, one of the things we would like to see happen with the protocol is that you get people in the field to see how these things work so that they can appreciate the different ways of going about things. Which is one of the things I love about natural systems is there's not always just one solution. There can be a lot of different solutions and a lot of different ways of doing something. So maybe we can get more people out in the field looking at things and evaluating them, then maybe there'll be some more creative solutions that happen.
And that brings me to my next question. So what would you think are the biggest challenges to making this new standard a success?
I think that people have gotten used to making commitments and that they have not necessarily always been required to be accountable. And there's been habits formed. And I think we're going to have to change that over time. I also think that there's a perception that, look, we only have so much money and we can't really spend it on monitoring or evaluating our progress, or we can't spend too much money on that. We're not asking them to spend much money. Honestly, they could probably spend 5% or less of their budgets on that, but the return on investment from doing that would be huge. So I think it's the financial side of it. I think it's the willingness to engage in this kind of exercise and this kind of activity that brings accountability to the whole sector. And I think that it's also a little bit of well, wait a minute, is how important is restoration anyway? And there are still some people who question climate change, who question that we have real issues in terms of climate change, and they question the role of forests. I think time will work with us in terms of those issues, and as we've seen by what's going on all around us in the world with fires and all those other things, that climate change is having its impact right now as we speak. And those arguments of saying, well, this isn't as important, I think those arguments are honestly going to disappear because it's just going to be in people's face that there's a new reality that we have to address.
So my last question for you, Richard, is how long does the consultation run for and how do people get involved?
Great. Yeah, it's online. All you have to do is go to nepcon.org and there's a spot there. You can provide a link or something for people to look at that. It's right now, I think we started the consultation about 2 weeks ago. So this first round of consultation will be 2 months. We don't want to rush it. So there's a lot of time right now to be able to provide input. The way it works is if we get a lot of input and people suggest a lot of things need to be changed, we'll probably take about a couple weeks to make changes and then do another round of consultation. If people come back and basically say, hey, look, they're mostly minor tweaks that need to be done and not many changes, then we can go right to using it on a more almost like a commercial basis. One of the things that Nepcon has done with this, which is philosophically something that I very strongly support, is they've called this basically an open methodology, a public use methodology. So once it's done, anybody can use it. It doesn't have to be just Nepcon doing it. Other organizations can implement it. And so I'm optimistic that with that kind of philosophy, that people will feel like, hey, we can use this. We don't have to, any way that we use it is going to make an improvement. So I'm hopeful that process, by being as open as it is and transparent, will make people get behind it.
Awesome. And in closing, are there any other comments you'd like to make?
I guess the last comment I'd make is that let's take our dogmatic hats off, and let's remember that there's all kinds of restoration approaches, and there's no one single solution. A lot of different ecosystems out there, a lot of different social and economic situations, a lot of different cultural situations. So we shouldn't be fixed on there's only one restoration solution. Let's make sure that we're open to a wide range of options, and make sure that whatever one of our hopes is that we've been flexible enough in the verification protocol to be able to evaluate or audit any kind of restoration that's happening, whether it's in temperate, tropical, or boreal forest, anywhere in the world. That's the goal. We'll see if it works out that way.
Okay, well, thank you for your time today, Richard. It's been really appreciated to learn more about this new standard, and we're really excited to have you join us next week for an interview as a conservation hero to discuss your lifetime of work in this space. So if any of the viewers have any questions for you, then please let us know, and we'll be sure to ask.
Great, Andrew. Thanks
Take care,
very much.
All the best.
All right,
mate.
cheers.